Part 1. Opening and Character Introduction. The evening shadows stretched long across Cedar Ridge as Sister Mary Catherine knelt before the simple wooden altar of St. Joseph's Chapel. The scent of pine from the freshly hewn pews mingled with the fading aroma of beeswax candles, creating the sacred atmosphere she had grown to cherish in this remote mountain town. Her fingers moved gently across the worn rosary beads, each prayer a whispered plea for the strength to face another day of tending to the sick and teaching the children who lived scattered across the harsh Colorado territory. At 24, Sister Mary Catherine possessed a quiet beauty that seemed to illuminate the humble chapel. Her auburn hair, hidden beneath the simple white coif of her order, occasionally caught the lamplight when she moved to tend the altar flowers or adjust the heavy curtains against the mountain winds. Her eyes, the color of spring violets, held a depth of compassion that drew the townspeople to her like moths to flame. Yet tonight, those same eyes reflected a troubling shadow of fear. The chapel door groaned on its leather hinges, and she turned to see a familiar silhouette filling the doorway. Bartholomew Morrison stepped inside without invitation, his spurs clicking against the rough-hewn floorboards with deliberate menace. Even in the dim candlelight, his presence seemed to consume the sacred space like smoke from a wildfire. Morrison was a man who had carved his fortune from the unforgiving landscape through sheer ruthlessness. His cattle ranch sprawled across 3 valleys, and his influence reached into every corner of Cedar Ridge like the roots of a poisonous weed. Standing over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an ox yoke, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to taking whatever he desired. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his cold gray eyes held no warmth, only calculation and possession. "Evening, sister," Morrison said, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a snake oil salesman. He removed his black Stetson but made no move to genuflect or show proper respect in the house of God. "Mighty late for prayers, ain't it?" Sister Mary Catherine rose slowly from her knees, her hands clasped before her in the posture of peaceful submission her order had taught her. Yet her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "Mr. Morrison, the chapel is always open for those seeking the Lord's comfort." Comfort. Morrison rolled the word around his tongue as if tasting something bitter. "That's a fine thing to mention, sister, because comfort is exactly what I'm here to discuss." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of whiskey on his breath, mixed with the leather and tobacco that seemed permanently embedded in his clothing. The candlelight cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, making him appear more devil than man. "I've been thinking considerable about your situation here," Morrison continued, his eyes scanning the modest interior of the chapel with obvious disdain. "This little church of yours, perched up here in the mountains like a bird's nest. Mighty precarious place for a young woman to be living all alone. I am not alone, Mr. Morrison. I have the Lord's protection and the kindness of the townspeople." Morrison's laugh was as cold as winter wind through bare branches. "The townspeople." He spoke the words as if they left a bad taste in his mouth. "Let me tell you something about those good folks down in town, sister. They're mighty fine at nodding their heads and tipping their hats when things are peaceful. But when trouble comes calling, real trouble, they tend to find pressing business elsewhere." Sister Mary Catherine felt her throat tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "What is it you want, Mr. Morrison?" The rancher took another step forward, close enough that she could see the cruel glint in his eyes. "I want to make you an offer, sister, a generous offer. You're a beautiful young woman, wasting away up here playing at being a bride of Christ. I'm proposing you become a bride in the flesh, my bride." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stepped backward until her shoulders pressed against the altar rail. "Mr. Morrison, I have taken sacred vows. I am pledged to serve God and this community. I will not break those vows." "Vows can be undone," Morrison said with casual cruelty. "Papers can be signed. The church hierarchy understands practical matters when they're explained properly. With the right donation to the right bishop, your little vows will disappear like morning mist. Even if such a thing were possible, which it is not, I would never consent to such an arrangement." Morrison's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. "Now, sister, I'm trying to be a gentleman about this. I'm offering you a fine house, pretty dresses, servants to tend your every need. You'd be the most important woman in the territory. That's a sight better than scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots for a bunch of ungrateful settlers." My answer is no. "Mr. Morrison, it will always be no." The silence that followed seemed to press against the chapel walls like a living thing. Morrison's jaw worked slowly, as if he were chewing on her words and finding them unpalatable. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I'm a patient man, sister. But my patience ain't unlimited, you see. I've taken a powerful fancy to you, and I'm not accustomed to being denied what I want. This little chapel sits on land that I happen to own, or will own, once certain legal matters are settled. If you were to become my wife, well, the church would naturally remain under my protection. If not—" He let the threat hang in the air like gun smoke. "You're speaking of the donation papers," Sister Mary Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The land was given to the church by the Hendricks family before they moved west. Legal documents can be complicated things," Morrison replied with a cold smile. "Sometimes they get lost. Sometimes they turn out to be forgeries. Sometimes it turns out the people who signed them didn't have clear title to begin with. Amazing how these things work out when a man has the right lawyers and the right friends in the territorial government." Sister Mary Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. Without the legal protection of church property, the chapel would be defenseless. The small community that gathered here each Sunday, the children she taught to read, the sick she tended, all of them would lose this sanctuary. "I can see you're beginning to understand the situation," Morrison continued. "But let me make it even clearer for you. I've got 15 men on my payroll. Sister, good men with families to feed, but they do what I tell them to do. If this chapel was to accidentally catch fire some night, well, accidents happen in these dry mountain winters, and if anyone was to get hurt trying to put out such a fire—" He shrugged eloquently, leaving the sentence unfinished. "You would threaten innocent people, women and children? I don't make threats, sister. I make promises, and I'm promising you that one way or another, you're going to be my wife. The easy way would be better for everyone concerned, but I'm prepared to take the hard way if that's how you want to play it." Morrison placed his hat back on his head and touched the brim in a mockery of politeness. "I'll give you 3 days to think it over. 3 days to pray about it and see the wisdom of accepting my generous offer. After that, well, I expect we'll start seeing some unfortunate accidents around Cedar Ridge." He turned toward the door, then paused without looking back. "Oh, and sister, don't go getting any ideas about running away. I've got friends all through these mountains. There ain't a trail or a hideout within 100 miles that I don't know about. You belong to me now, whether you admit it or not." The chapel door slammed shut behind him with a sound like thunder, leaving Sister Mary Catherine alone with the flickering candles in her racing heart. She sank to her knees before the altar, her hands trembling as she clasped them in prayer. Outside, The wind began to howl through the pine trees that surrounded the chapel, and the first drops of rain started pattering against the windows. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of approaching thunder, as if the very heavens were responding to the evil that had just polluted this sacred space. Sister Mary Catherine closed her eyes and prayed with desperate fervor, pleading for guidance, for protection, for some miracle that might deliver her and the people she served from the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. The storm that was brewing outside seemed mild compared to the tempest that Morrison's words had unleashed in her heart. As the rain began in earnest, drumming against the chapel roof like fingers of the damned, she remained on her knees before the altar, seeking solace in prayer while fear gnawed at her soul like a hungry wolf. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that her prayers might not be enough this time, that it would take more than faith to stand against a man like Bartholomew Morrison. But she continued to pray anyway, because prayer was all she had, and in the end, it was all she had ever had. Part 2. The stranger's arrival, 50 miles south of Cedar Ridge. James McKenna guided his weary mare through the treacherous mountain pass as the storm unleashed its fury upon the Colorado Territory. Lightning split the darkness above the towering pines, illuminating his weathered face for brief moments before plunging him back into shadow. At 32, James carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had learned to depend on no one but himself, and the sharp bite of his axe. His broad shoulders bore the marks of 15 years spent felling timber in the forests of Oregon, Montana, and now Colorado. His hands, calloused from countless hours gripping axe handles and crosscut saws, guided his horse with gentle certainty through the mud and stone. Beneath the brim of his worn hat, his dark brown eyes held the distant look of a man who had seen too much sorrow and had spent too many years running from memories that followed him like persistent shadows. The saddlebag strapped behind him contained everything he owned: a few changes of clothes, his tools, a Bible that had belonged to his late wife, and a small wooden cross he had carved during the long winter nights when grief kept sleep at bay. He was traveling light, as he always did these days, ready to move on when the past caught up with him or when the loneliness became too much to bear. Thunder crashed overhead, and his horse shied nervously beneath him. James leaned forward to pat her neck, speaking in the low, soothing voice he had once used to calm his wife during the difficult nights before childbirth. "Easy there, Rosie, we'll find shelter soon enough." But even as he spoke the words, James wasn't sure he believed them. The storm had caught him between settlements, and the trail ahead wound through territory he didn't know. He had left the last mining camp 3 days ago after finishing a contract to clear timber for a new shaft. The foreman had paid him fairly and even offered steady work through the winter. But James had declined. Staying in one place too long made the memories too sharp, too real. Elizabeth had been gone for 3 years now, but there were still moments when he would turn to share something with her, only to remember that she was never coming back. She had died giving birth to their son, who had lived only long enough for James to hold him once before joining his mother in whatever peace lay beyond this hard world. The guilt that gnawed at him was always the same. If he had been content to stay in Oregon instead of chasing rumors of better opportunities in Montana, if he had found a doctor instead of relying on the midwife, if he had somehow been a better husband, a better provider. The list of if-onlys stretched longer than any trail he had ever walked. After the funeral, he had sold their little cabin and everything they had built together, unable to bear the constant reminders of what he had lost. Since then, he had wandered from job to job, town to town, always moving, never settling, carrying his grief like a pack that grew heavier with each passing mile. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the path ahead, and James caught sight of something that made him rein in his horse. There, perhaps 2 miles distant through the storm, a church bell tower rose above the tree line like a beacon. Even through the driving rain and howling wind, he could make out the warm glow of windows in what appeared to be a small settlement nestled in the valley below. Something stirred in James's chest, a feeling he had almost forgotten. It wasn't quite hope, but it was the first emotion other than grief and guilt that he had felt in months. The sight of that church tower seemed to call to something deep within him, as if Elizabeth herself were guiding him toward whatever waited in that distant valley. "Hey, come on, girl," he murmured to his horse. "Let's see what kind of welcome they have for strangers in this place." The descent into the valley was treacherous, with the trail turned to slick mud by the storm. More than once, Rosie stumbled on the loose stones and James had to use all his skill to keep them both from sliding off the narrow path into the dark ravine below. But gradually, the lights grew brighter, and he began to make out individual buildings scattered along what appeared to be a main street. Cedar Ridge was not much different from a dozen other mountain settlements James had passed through in his wanderings. A collection of rough-hewn buildings huddled together against the wilderness, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and various houses and cabins spread out along the hillsides. But dominating it all was the white-painted chapel with its simple bell tower, standing like a guardian angel over the sleeping town. James made his way slowly down the main street, his horse's hooves squelching in the mud. Most of the buildings were dark, their occupants sensibly asleep while the storm raged outside. But warm light spilled from the windows of what appeared to be a stable and boarding house near the center of town. He dismounted outside the stable and led Rosie under the covered area where several other horses stood patiently waiting out the storm. The familiar smells of hay and leather and horse sweat welcomed him like old friends. A grizzled man in his 50s emerged from the depths of the stable, carrying a lantern and wearing the skeptical expression of someone roused from sleep by an unexpected visitor. "Evening," the man said, sizing up James with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to judge character quickly. "Name's Thomas Bradley. You picked a hell of a night to be traveling stranger." "James McKenna," James replied, removing his hat and shaking the rain from it. "And you're right about the night. I was hoping I might find somewhere to stable my horse and maybe rent a room until the storm passes." Thomas nodded toward the boarding house next door. "Sarah Wilson runs the rooms upstairs. Clean beds, fair prices, and the best coffee this side of Denver. Your horse will be safe here. I used to be the sheriff in this town before I took up keeping horses. Old habits die hard. I keep a good eye on things." As Thomas began tending to Rosie, James found himself drawn once again to look up at the chapel. Even through the storm, there seemed to be a light burning in one of the windows. "Someone's up late at the church," James observed. Thomas followed his gaze and his expression darkened slightly. "That'd be Sister Mary Catherine. Fine woman, that one. Takes care of the sick folks, teaches the children, tends to anyone who needs tending. But lately—" He paused, as if unsure whether to continue. "Lately?" Thomas glanced around, though there was no one else in sight. "Well, I reckon it ain't my place to spread gossip, but that woman's been looking mighty troubled these past few weeks. Bart Morrison's been sniffing around the chapel more than a man has any business doing. And Morrison ain't the type to take no for an answer, if you catch my meaning." "Morrison?" "Bartholomew Morrison owns the biggest spread in 3 counties. Rich as Midas and twice as mean. Most folks around here are too scared of him to speak up when he gets to pushing people around." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Including me. God help me. Used to be I'd stand up to men like Morrison, but I got a wife and grandchildren to think about now." James felt a familiar stir of anger in his chest. In his wanderings, he had encountered men like Morrison before, bullies who used their wealth and influence to take whatever they wanted from those too weak to resist. The thought of such a man threatening a woman of God touched something deep and protective within him. "This Sister Mary Catherine," James said carefully. "She has no one to speak for her? No family?" Thomas shook his head. "She came here about 2 years ago from back east. Never talks about her past. But I get the impression she left everything behind when she took her vows. The church hierarchy is hundreds of miles away, and even if they cared about one little chapel in the middle of nowhere, they couldn't get here in time to help if Morrison decides to press his suit." Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, James could see the chapel clearly. The light in the window seemed to flicker, as if someone were moving about inside. He found himself wondering what kind of woman would choose to serve God in such a remote and dangerous place, and what thoughts were keeping her awake during this storm. "Thank you for the information," James said, "and for taking care of my horse." "You planning to stay long in Cedar Ridge?" Thomas asked. James considered the question. 3 hours ago, he would have said no without hesitation. He had been planning to rest for a day or two and then move on, as he always did. But something about this place, about the story Thomas had just told him, made him hesitate. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "I suppose that depends on whether there's any work to be found hereabouts." Thomas smiled for the first time since James had arrived. "Funny you should mention that. The town's been talking about expanding the chapel, adding on a proper schoolroom and maybe a clinic for Sister Mary Catherine to tend the sick. But we'd need someone who knows timber work to help with the construction. Most of the men around here are miners or ranchers. Not many know how to handle lumber proper." "I might be interested in hearing more about that," James said, surprising himself with the words. As he made his way through the mud toward the boarding house, James found his eyes drawn once more to the chapel window. The light still burned there, steady and warm against the storm. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something that might have been purpose stirring in his chest. Perhaps it was time to stop running from his past and start building something for the future. Perhaps this remote mountain town and its troubled nun were exactly what he needed to find his way back to the man he used to be. The storm continued to rage around Cedar Ridge, but James McKenna no longer felt like a stranger lost in the wilderness. He felt like a man who might just have found his way home. Part 3. First Meeting. The morning sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds as James McKenna walked the short distance from Sarah Wilson's boarding house to St. Joseph's Chapel. The air was crisp and clean after the night's rain, carrying the scent of wet pine and fresh earth. Puddles reflected the brightening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song from atop a fence post. James had slept better than he had in months, perhaps because the sound of the rain on the roof had reminded him of peaceful nights in the Oregon cabin he had shared with Elizabeth. For the first time in 3 years, he had awakened without the immediate urge to pack his belongings and move on to the next town. Something about Cedar Ridge felt different, though he couldn't quite name what it was. The chapel bell had rung a few minutes earlier, calling the faithful to Sunday morning service. James had attended church sporadically since Elizabeth's death, finding it difficult to reconcile his faith with his loss. But this morning, he felt drawn to the simple white building that had served as his beacon through the storm. As he approached the chapel, he could hear voices raised in hymn from within. The sound was sweet and clear in the mountain air, carried by perhaps 20 voices singing "How Great Thou Art," with the kind of heartfelt devotion that could only come from people who had learned to find beauty in a harsh and unforgiving world. James paused at the chapel door, suddenly uncertain. His clothes were clean but well worn, and he wondered if a drifting lumberjack would be welcome among the established families of Cedar Ridge. But the singing drew him forward, and he quietly slipped inside, taking a seat in the back pew. The interior of the chapel was simple but lovingly maintained. Rough-hewn pews lined the narrow aisle, and wildflowers in mason jars adorned the windowsills. Morning light streamed through the glass, creating patterns of gold and amber on the wooden floor. At the front of the chapel stood a modest altar with a simple wooden cross, and before it, leading the congregation in song, was the most beautiful woman James had ever seen. Sister Mary Catherine stood with her back to the congregation, her voice rising pure and clear above the others. Even beneath the modest habit of her order, her grace was evident in every movement. When she turned to face the congregation as the hymn ended, James felt his breath catch in his throat. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her mid-20s, with delicate features that seemed to glow with an inner light. Her eyes, a remarkable shade of violet blue, swept across the congregation with warmth and compassion. But James, trained by years of reading the forest for signs of danger, noticed something else in those eyes, a shadow of fear that she was trying desperately to hide. "Let us pray," Sister Mary Catherine said, her voice soft but carrying easily through the small chapel. As the congregation bowed their heads, James found himself studying her face, noting the slight tension around her eyes and the way her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she held her prayer book. The service was simple and heartfelt. Sister Mary Catherine read from the Gospel of Matthew, speaking of Jesus' words, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Her voice gained strength as she spoke, but James noticed how her gaze occasionally drifted to the windows, as if she were watching for something, or someone. When the service ended, the congregation filed out slowly, many stopping to speak with Sister Mary Catherine. James hung back, listening to the conversations around him. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her youngest was running a fever and asked if the sister might stop by later. Old Pete Morrison, no relation to Bartholomew, James learned from the whispered conversation behind him, needed someone to read a letter from his son in California. A young mother sought advice about her husband's drinking. To each request, Sister Mary Catherine responded with gentle kindness, promising to visit the sick child, offering to read the letter that afternoon, and suggesting that the troubled wife might find comfort in prayer and perhaps speak with some of the other women in the community who had faced similar challenges. Gradually, the chapel emptied until only James and Sister Mary Catherine remained. She was gathering her prayer book and hymnals when she noticed him still sitting in the back pew. Their eyes met across the empty chapel, and James felt a jolt of recognition. Not that he had seen her before, but that he was looking at someone who understood loss and sorrow as deeply as he did. "Good morning," she said, walking toward him with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Sister Mary Catherine." James stood and removed his hat. "James McKenna, sister. I arrived in town last night during the storm. Thomas Bradley mentioned that your chapel might be planning some construction work, and I wanted to introduce myself. I'm a carpenter and timberman by trade. Mr. McKenna." She extended her hand in greeting, and James noticed how small and soft it was compared to his own calloused palm. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge. Yes, we have discussed expanding the chapel to include a proper schoolroom and perhaps a small clinic. The community has been very generous with donations, but we lack someone with the proper skills to oversee the construction. I'd be interested in hearing more about your plans," James said. "But first, if you don't mind my saying so, you look troubled. Is everything all right?" Sister Mary Catherine's composure faltered for just a moment, and James saw the fear she had been hiding rise to the surface like a fish breaking water. She glanced toward the windows again, then back at him. "And it's nothing that concerns you, Mr. McKenna. Just some difficulties with local matters that I'm sure will resolve themselves." But even as she spoke the words, James could see that she didn't believe them. The fear in her eyes was real and immediate, and it stirred something protective within him that he thought had died with Elizabeth. "Sister," he said gently, "I may be a stranger here, but I've been around long enough to recognize when someone's in trouble, and I've learned that keeping problems to yourself usually makes them worse, not better." For a long moment, Sister Mary Catherine studied his face. James had the feeling that she was weighing his words, trying to decide whether she could trust this stranger who had appeared in her chapel like an answer to prayer. "Perhaps we could sit for a moment," she said finally, gesturing toward the front pew. They sat together in the peaceful silence of the chapel, morning light streaming through the windows and dust motes dancing in the golden air. James waited patiently, sensing that whatever was troubling her needed to be spoken in her own time and her own way. "There is a man," she began slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "A wealthy rancher named Bartholomew Morrison. He has made certain demands that I cannot and will not meet." James felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of demands?" Sister Mary Catherine's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at her hands. "He wants me to renounce my vows and become his wife. When I refused, he made it clear that my refusal would have consequences for the entire community." "What kind of consequences?" "He claims to have legal ownership of the land the chapel sits on. He says if I don't agree to his proposal, he'll have the chapel torn down and anyone who tries to stop him will be hurt." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He has 15 men working for him. Mr. McKenna, the people of Cedar Ridge are good folks, but they're not fighters. They have families to protect." James felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same righteous fury that had once driven him to stand up to bullies in logging camps and mining towns. But this was different. This was a man threatening a woman of God, using his wealth and power to force himself on someone who had devoted her life to serving others. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, keeping his voice calm despite the storm building inside him. "He first approached me about a month ago. At first, I thought he was simply making conversation. He would come to services occasionally, always sitting in the back, always watching me. But then he began staying after services, asking personal questions, making comments about how a young woman shouldn't be living alone in such a remote place." Sister Mary Catherine paused, as if gathering courage to continue. "3 nights ago, he came to the chapel after dark. That's when he made his proposal, and his threats clear. He gave me 3 days to consider his offer." James did quick arithmetic in his head. "That means tomorrow is the deadline." "Yes," the word came out as barely a breath. "And you're sure he means what he says about the chapel and the people?" Sister Mary Catherine nodded, and James saw tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Bartholomew Morrison is not a man who makes idle threats, Mr. McKenna. He owns most of the land for miles around. He has influence with the territorial government, and he has a reputation for getting what he wants, no matter who gets hurt in the process." James was quiet for a long moment, thinking. He had faced dangerous men before, but usually as part of a group of loggers or miners who could stand together. This was different. If Morrison was as powerful as Sister Mary Catherine suggested, standing against him could mean making enemies of half the territory. But as he looked at the woman sitting beside him, her quiet dignity, her obvious devotion to her calling, her courage in the face of overwhelming odds. James felt something awaken in him that had been dormant since Elizabeth's death. A sense of purpose. A reason to stay and fight instead of always running away. "Sister," he said carefully, "what if I told you that you don't have to face this alone?" She looked up at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Mr. McKenna, I appreciate your kindness, but this isn't your fight. You don't understand how dangerous Morrison can be. If you were to interfere—" "I've dealt with dangerous men before," James said quietly. "And I've learned that bullies like Morrison count on people being too scared to stand up to them. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say no." "But you could be killed." The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back. "Morrison has money, influence, armed men. You're just one person, and you're new here. No one would blame you if you simply rode on to the next town." James smiled grimly. "Maybe not. But I'd blame myself. You see, sister, I spent the last 3 years running away from things that hurt too much to face. I've been telling myself it was easier to keep moving than to put down roots and risk losing something precious again. But sitting here, listening to your story, I realize that running away hasn't made the pain any less. It's just made me a coward." He turned to face her fully. "I can't bring back my wife, and I can't undo the mistakes I made. But maybe I can keep Morrison from destroying something good and pure in this world. Maybe I can finally stop running and start fighting for something that matters." Sister Mary Catherine studied his face for a long moment, and James could see her weighing his words against her fears for his safety. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you risk your life for people you've known for less than a day?" James considered the question, trying to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand himself. "I don't know if I can explain it properly," he said finally. "But when I saw your chapel through the storm last night, it felt like I was being called home. And when I see someone like Morrison trying to destroy something beautiful and sacred, everything in me rebels against it." He paused, then added more softly, "Maybe it's because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. And maybe, if I can help keep that from happening to someone else, it might give some meaning to my own losses." Tears were flowing freely down Sister Mary Catherine's cheeks now, but she was smiling through them. "Mr. McKenna, James, I don't know what to say. I've been praying for guidance, for help, for some way out of this nightmare. And then you appeared in my chapel like an answer to prayer. I'm not much of an angel," James said with a slight smile, "but I am a man who knows how to handle an axe and isn't afraid of a fight. And I'm telling you right now, sister, that Morrison is not going to hurt you or this community, not while I'm here to stop him." Outside the chapel, clouds were gathering again, promising another storm. But inside, for the first time in days, Sister Mary Catherine felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps her prayers had been answered after all. Perhaps God had sent her a protector in the form of a lonely lumberjack with sad eyes and a generous heart. "What do we do now?" she asked. James stood and placed his hat back on his head. "Now I go introduce myself to Mr. Morrison. I think it's time he learned that you're not as alone as he thinks you are." Part 4. Direct conflict with Morrison. James McKenna stepped out of the chapel into the bright Monday morning sunshine, his jaw set with determination and purpose he hadn't felt in 3 years. The conversation with Sister Mary Catherine had awakened something fierce and protective within him, a reminder of the man he used to be before grief had worn him down to a shadow of himself. His first stop was Harold Patterson's General Store, a weathered building that served as the commercial heart of Cedar Ridge. The wooden sidewalk creaked under his boots as he pushed through the door, causing the brass bell above to announce his arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed oddly out of place given the dark business that had brought him here. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and the 100 different items crammed onto its shelves, bolts of cloth, canned goods, tools, ammunition, and sundries that kept the isolated mountain community supplied through the long winters. Harold Patterson himself stood behind the counter, a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Morning," Harold said, looking up from his ledger. "You must be the fellow Thomas mentioned, the carpenter who rode in during the storm. James McKenna, wasn't it?" "That's right. I was hoping you might have some ammunition in stock, .44 caliber, if you have it." Harold's expression grew cautious. "Planning on doing some hunting, Mr. McKenna?" "Something like that," James replied evenly. "I like to be prepared for whatever might come my way," as Harold moved to retrieve the ammunition from behind the counter. The store's front door banged open with enough force to rattle the windows. James turned to see 3 men enter, their spurs jangling and their hands resting casually on the butts of their revolvers. The leader was a tall, lean man with a carefully waxed mustache and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of James's appearance. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone accustomed to being feared. "Harold, I see you've got yourself a new customer. Mind if we have a word with him?" Harold's face had gone pale, and James noticed the shopkeeper's hands trembling slightly as he set the box of cartridges on the counter. "Rex, I don't want any trouble in my store." "No trouble at all, Harold," Rex replied, though his eyes never left James. "Just a friendly conversation between neighbors." James had encountered men like Rex Caldwell before, hired guns who wore their reputation for violence like a badge of honor. The 2 men flanking him were cut from the same cloth, hard-faced men with dead eyes and quick hands. James recognized the type from logging camps and mining towns where disputes were often settled with lead rather than words. "You boys seem to know who I am," James said calmly, making no move toward his own weapon. "But I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Rex smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Rex Caldwell, foreman for the Morrison Ranch. These are my associates, Jake Patterson and Samuel Davis. We heard there was a stranger in town, and Mr. Morrison likes to keep track of who's passing through his territory." "His territory?" James raised an eyebrow. "I was under the impression Cedar Ridge was a free town." "Free is a relative term," Rex said, stepping closer. "Mr. Morrison owns most of the land hereabouts, employs most of the men, and keeps the peace in his own way. He doesn't like it when strangers come to town and start stirring up trouble." "I haven't stirred up any trouble. In fact, I've been nothing but neighborly since I arrived." Jake Patterson, a stocky man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, let out a harsh laugh. "Neighborly? Is that what you call sniffing around the chapel, getting cozy with Sister Mary Catherine?" James felt his temper begin to rise, but he kept his voice level. "I attended church services like any God-fearing man might do. If that constitutes trouble in Mr. Morrison's eyes, perhaps he needs to examine his own relationship with the Almighty." Rex's hand moved closer to his gun. "You got a smart mouth on you, stranger. Mr. Morrison doesn't appreciate smart mouths, especially when they belong to drifters who don't know their place." "And what exactly is my place?" "Gone." Samuel Davis spoke for the first time, his voice as flat and emotionless as his stare. "Packed up and riding out of town before you wear out your welcome." James studied the 3 men for a long moment, reading the signs he had learned to recognize in dangerous situations. They were confident, probably skilled, and definitely used to intimidating people into submission. But James had faced down grizzly bears and survived logging accidents that would have killed lesser men. A few hired thugs didn't impress him much. "That's interesting advice," James said finally. "But I think I'll stick around for a while. Cedar Ridge seems like a nice place to settle down. In fact, I'm considering taking on some construction work for the church. Building projects can take months to complete properly." The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rex's eyes narrowed to slits, and his hand moved to rest on his gun butt. "Mister, I don't think you understand what you're getting yourself into. This ain't some wide-open mining camp where a man can do as he pleases. This is Morrison country, and Mr. Morrison has plans that don't include interference from saddle tramps with more guts than brains. Plans that involve forcing a woman of God to break her sacred vows?" James asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Rex's face darkened, and Jake Patterson actually took a step backward, as if James had just announced he was carrying dynamite. Even Harold Patterson gasped audibly from behind the counter. "I'd be real careful about repeating gossip," Rex said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Especially gossip that reflects poorly on Mr. Morrison's character. A man could find himself in serious trouble spreading tales like that." "I'm not spreading tales," James replied. "I'm stating facts. Sister Mary Catherine told me about Morrison's proposition and his threats. She's scared, and she has every right to be, but she's not alone anymore." Rex laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "One drifter with a carpenter's tools thinks he can stand against Bartholomew Morrison? Boy, you're either the bravest man I ever met or the stupidest." "Maybe a little of both," James admitted. "But I've found that bullies are usually cowards at heart. They prefer to pick on people who can't fight back. When someone finally stands up to them, they tend to fold faster than a bad poker hand." "Is that a fact?" Rex's hand was now gripping his gun, though he hadn't drawn it yet. "Well, let me give you a fact in return. Carpenter, Mr. Morrison has 15 armed men on his payroll, men who are very good at what they do, men who wouldn't think twice about making a troublemaker disappear into these mountains permanently. 15 against 1 does seem like poor odds," James conceded. "Of course, that assumes all 15 would be willing to face a man in a fair fight. My experience has been that hired guns prefer to work in the dark, against unarmed victims. They're not so eager when they're looking down the barrel of a gun held by someone who knows how to use it." Jake Patterson spat tobacco juice onto Harold's clean floor. "You talk mighty big for a man who's outnumbered 3-1 right here and now." James smiled grimly. 3-1 assumes you boys are as fast as you think you are, and it assumes Harold here wouldn't object to you turning his store into a shooting gallery. Bad for business, I'd imagine. Harold Patterson had indeed found his voice, though it quavered with fear. "Rex, please, this is a place of business. If you have differences with Mr. McKenna, settle them outside." Rex glared at the shopkeeper, then back at James. "You're right, Harold. No need to make a mess in here." His eyes fixed on James with the intensity of a hawk studying a rabbit. "But this conversation isn't over, Carpenter. Not by a long shot." "I didn't think it was," James replied calmly. "In fact, I'm looking forward to continuing it. Perhaps you could tell Mr. and Morrison that I'd be happy to discuss Sister Mary Catherine's situation with him directly, man to man, without an audience of hired guns." Samuel Davis shook his head in apparent disbelief. "You actually want to face Morrison? You do realize he didn't get where he is by being soft, don't you?" "I'm counting on it," James said. "Soft men don't usually need to threaten women and children to get their way. I prefer dealing with men who are willing to settle their differences honestly. Rex Caldwell studied James for another long moment, as if trying to decide whether the carpenter was incredibly brave or simply insane. Finally, he touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "I'll give Mr. Morrison your message," he said. "But I'd advise you to spend your time between now and then making peace with your maker, because when Morrison's finished with you, there won't be enough left to bury." The three men turned and walked out of the store, their spurs jangling ominously on the wooden floor. Through the window, James watched them mount their horses and ride toward the south, where smoke from distant chimneys marked the location of Morrison's ranch. Harold Patterson let out a shaky breath and mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Mr. McKenna, I hope you know what you're doing. Morrison isn't just another rancher. He's got connections all the way to the territorial capital. Men who cross him have a way of disappearing." "I appreciate the warning, Harold," James said, picking up the box of ammunition and placing money on the counter. "But sometimes a man has to take a stand, regardless of the consequences." "But why?" Harold asked desperately. "You don't owe us anything. You could be on the trail by sunset, safe from Morrison's reach." James considered the question as he pocketed the cartridges. How could he explain that he was tired of running, tired of letting grief and guilt make his decisions for him? How could he make Harold understand that Sister Mary Catherine's courage in the face of Morrison's threats had reminded him of what it meant to fight for something greater than himself? "Harold," he said finally, "I've spent the last 3 years running away from things that hurt too much to face. I've told myself it was easier to keep moving than to put down roots and risk losing something precious again. But I've learned that running doesn't make the pain go away, it just makes you a coward." He headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. Sister Mary Catherine is fighting to protect not just herself, but this entire community. She's willing to face Morrison's threats rather than abandon the people who depend on her. If a woman of God can show that kind of courage, then maybe it's time I remembered what it means to be a man. James stepped out into the sunshine, leaving Harold Patterson staring after him with a mixture of admiration and terror. Word of the confrontation would spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, and by evening, everyone in town would know that a stranger had dared to challenge Bartholomew Morrison's authority. As James walked back toward the chapel, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced before dangerous river crossings and precarious climbs in the logging woods. It was the knowledge that he had committed himself to a course of action that might very well get him killed. But for the first time in 3 years, he also felt truly alive. The grief and guilt that had weighed him down were still there, but they were no longer the only things defining him. He had found something worth fighting for. Someone worth protecting, and perhaps most importantly, a chance to be the man Elizabeth would have wanted him to be. Sister Mary Catherine was waiting for him when he reached the chapel, her violet eyes filled with concern and hope in equal measure. The die had been cast, and there would be no turning back now. Tomorrow, Bartholomew Morrison would come calling, and James McKenna would be ready for him. Part 5. Morrison's Ultimatum. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as word of James McKenna's confrontation with Rex Caldwell spread through the town like ripples across a still pond. By evening, every man, woman, and child knew that a stranger had dared to challenge Bartholomew Morrison's authority, and the very air seemed to crackle with tension and anticipation. James spent the remainder of Monday preparing for what he knew was inevitable. He cleaned and oiled his Colt .44, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing back memories of dangerous nights in mining camps and logging towns where disputes were settled with lead rather than words. He also sharpened his carpenter's tools, knowing that in close quarters, his trusty axe might prove more reliable than any firearm. As twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, James made his way to the chapel for evening prayers. He found Sister Mary Catherine kneeling before the altar, her lips moving silently in fervent supplication. The candlelight flickered across her face, highlighting the worry lines that had deepened since their morning conversation. "Sister," James said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and he saw that her violet eyes were red from unshed tears. "James, I've been praying all day, but I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is about to happen." "Maybe it is," James admitted, settling into the pew beside her. "But sometimes terrible things need to happen before better things can take their place. Sometimes you have to fight through the darkness to reach the dawn." Before Sister Mary Catherine could respond, the chapel door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Bartholomew Morrison strode inside, followed by Rex Caldwell and 4 other armed men. Even in the sacred space of the chapel, Morrison radiated an aura of barely controlled violence that made the very air seem heavy and oppressive. "Well, well," Morrison said, his cold gray eyes fixing on James with predatory intensity. "So you're the carpenter who thinks he can interfere in my business." James rose slowly from the pew, placing himself between Morrison and Sister Mary Catherine. "Mr. Morrison, I presume I've been looking forward to meeting you." Morrison was even more imposing up close than James had imagined. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox yoke and hands that looked capable of crushing a man's windpipe, the rancher carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been successfully challenged. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his weathered face bore the marks of a man who had spent his life taking whatever he wanted through force and intimidation. "Have you now?" Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Rex tells me you had quite an interesting conversation in Harold's store this morning. Something about protecting Sister Mary Catherine from my advances." "That's right," James replied calmly. "The lady has made her position clear. She's not interested in your proposal, and she shouldn't have to live in fear because of it." Morrison's laugh was like gravel grinding in a mill. "Fear? Is that what she told you? Sister, you wound me deeply. I've been nothing but a gentleman in my courtship." Sister Mary Catherine found her voice, though it trembled with suppressed emotion. "Courtship? Mr. Morrison, you threatened to burn down the chapel and harm innocent people if I didn't submit to your demands. That is not courtship. That is extortion. Strong words from a woman who claims to follow the teachings of Christ." Morrison replied, "Didn't your Savior teach forgiveness and turning the other cheek? Perhaps you should practice what you preach." James felt his temper flare at the blasphemous mockery in Morrison's voice. "Don't quote scripture to justify your wickedness. Morrison, Christ also drove the money changers from the temple with a whip. Sometimes righteous anger is called for." Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Righteous anger? You think you're some kind of avenging angel, carpenter? Let me tell you what you really are. You're a saddle tramp who doesn't know when to mind his own business." He stepped closer, close enough that James could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cold calculation in his gray eyes. "I've done some checking on you. McKenna. Word is you used to be married. Had yourself a wife and child up in Oregon. Word is they died, and you've been running from town to town ever since, drowning your sorrows in whatever bottle you can find." James felt his blood turn to ice. The mention of Elizabeth and their lost son was like a physical blow, and for a moment, the familiar wave of grief and guilt threatened to overwhelm him. But then he saw the cruel satisfaction in Morrison's eyes. and his sorrow transformed into something harder and more dangerous. "Leave them out of this," James said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made even Rex Caldwell shift nervously. "Touched a nerve, did I?" Morrison's smile widened. "Good, because I want you to understand exactly what you're dealing with here. You think you can play the hero, save the damsel in distress, maybe redeem yourself for failing to save your own family? Well, let me disabuse you of that romantic notion right now." Morrison gestured toward his men, who spread out to cover the chapel's exits. "See, McKenna, this isn't some fairy tale where the noble knight rescues the princess and they live happily ever after. This is the real world, where money and power make the rules and dreamers like you end up 6 feet under." Sister Mary Catherine stepped forward, her face pale but her voice steady. "Mr. Morrison, please. If your quarrel is with me, then settle it with me. Don't threaten Mr. McKenna for trying to help." "Oh, but sister, that's where you're wrong," Morrison replied with mock gentleness. "My quarrel isn't with you at all. You're simply a prize to be won, a beautiful addition to my collection. My quarrel is with anyone stupid enough to think they can stand between me and what I want." He turned his attention back to James. "You see, Carpenter, I've built an empire in these mountains through careful planning and decisive action. When obstacles appear, I remove them. When competition arises, I crush it. When someone threatens what's mine, I eliminate that threat permanently." "Sister Mary Catherine isn't yours," James said firmly. "She belongs to no man. She's consecrated her life to God and to serving this community." "God?" Morrison laughed harshly. "God helps those who help themselves, McKenna, and I'm helping myself to the most beautiful woman in the territory. As for serving the community, she'll serve it much better as my wife, bearing my children and gracing my table, than she will scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots for a bunch of ungrateful settlers." The blasphemy and casual cruelty in Morrison's words made James's hand twitch toward his gun, but he forced himself to remain calm. This wasn't the time or place for gunplay, not with Sister Mary Catherine caught in the crossfire. "You still haven't answered my question," James said. "What do you want from me?" Morrison studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his options. "What I want, McKenna, is for you to pack your gear and ride out of Cedar Ridge tonight. Leave before dawn, and never come back. Do that, and I'll allow you to live. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning, you'll discover just how permanent my solutions can be." Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "I have 15 armed men on my payroll, McKenna. Good men who follow orders without question. If you're still in Cedar Ridge when the sun rises, they'll hunt you down like a rabid dog and put you out of your misery." Sister Mary Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Mr. Morrison, surely you wouldn't—" "Wouldn't what, sister? Defend my property and my interests? Remove a threat to the peace and stability of my domain?" Morrison's cold smile never wavered. "I've done worse things than eliminate one troublesome drifter. Believe me." James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded a moment of crucial decision. He could leave, as Morrison demanded. He could saddle Rosie and ride away into the night, leaving Sister Mary Catherine to face her fate alone. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that would keep him alive to see another sunrise. But as he looked at the woman standing beside him, her quiet dignity, her unwavering faith, her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, James knew that running away was no longer an option. He had spent 3 years fleeing from pain and responsibility, and it had brought him nothing but deeper sorrow and crushing guilt. Here, finally, was a chance to stand for something greater than himself. to be the man Elizabeth would have wanted him to be. "I appreciate the offer, Morrison," James said calmly, "but I think I'll decline. You see, I've spent too many years running away from fights that mattered. I'm not about to start running again, especially not from a bully who preys on women and children." Morrison's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. "You're making a mistake, Carpenter. Your last mistake." "Maybe," James acknowledged, "but it's my mistake to make, and I'd rather die fighting for something worthwhile than live as a coward who abandoned someone in need." For a moment, the chapel was silent except for the soft crackling of candles and the distant sound of wind in the pine trees. Then Morrison nodded slowly, as if James had just confirmed something he had suspected all along. "Oh, so be it," the rancher said. "Rex, spread the word to the boys. At dawn, we settle this once and for all. I want every man armed and ready. No witnesses, no survivors." As Morrison and his men turned to leave, he paused at the chapel door and looked back at Sister Mary Catherine. "I'm sorry you'll have to see this, my dear. But perhaps witnessing the fate of those who oppose me will help you understand the wisdom of accepting my proposal. After we dispose of your champion, we'll discuss the arrangements for our wedding." "I will never marry you," Sister Mary Catherine said, her voice ringing with quiet defiance. "Not if you kill 1,000 innocent men." Morrison's smile was colder than winter wind through bare branches. "We'll see, sister. We'll see." After the rancher and his men had gone, Sister Mary Catherine sank onto the front pew, her face pale and her hands trembling. "James, what have we done? Morrison will bring his entire crew tomorrow. 15 armed men against one, and it's impossible." James sat beside her, his mind already working through possibilities and strategies. "Maybe not as impossible as it seems. Bullies like Morrison are used to intimidating unarmed farmers and shopkeepers. They're not used to facing someone who's ready to fight back. But 15 against one won't all come at once," James interrupted. "Men like that are cowards at heart. They'll try to surround me, cut off my escape routes, force me into the open where they can pick me off safely. But if I choose the ground and timing, I might be able to even the odds." Sister Mary Catherine turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "James, please, I can't bear the thought of you dying because of me. If Morrison wants me so badly, perhaps I should—" "No." James's voice was firm but gentle. "Don't even think about sacrificing yourself to that monster. Elizabeth used to tell me that sometimes God puts us in places where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. This is one of those times." He took her hands in his, feeling their softness and warmth. "I can't promise I'll survive tomorrow, sister. But I can promise that I won't let Morrison hurt you or this community without a fight. And maybe, if I'm very lucky and God is very merciful, I'll live to see you safe and free." And Sister Mary Catherine squeezed his hands tightly, her violet eyes shining with tears and something that might have been love. "Then I'll pray for you. James McKenna. I'll pray harder than I've ever prayed in my life." As they knelt together before the altar, seeking strength and guidance for the battle that awaited them at dawn. Neither of them noticed the shadowy figure watching from the darkness outside the chapel window. Change was coming to Cedar Ridge, and blood would flow before the sun set again. Part 6. The Day of Decision. Dawn broke gray and cold over Cedar Ridge, with wisps of morning mist clinging to the pine trees like ghostly fingers. James McKenna knelt in the chapel beside Sister Mary Catherine, both of them seeking strength in prayer as the first light of what might be his last day crept through the stained glass windows. James had spent the night preparing for battle with the methodical care of a man who understood that survival often depended on small details. His Colt 44 was cleaned, loaded, and secured in its holster. Extra ammunition lined his gun belt, and his carpenter's axe hung within easy reach. He had chosen his position carefully, behind the heavy wooden pews that would provide some protection from gunfire, with clear sight lines to both the front door and the windows. James," Sister Mary Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft crackling of the candles. "There's still time. You could slip out the back, take your horse, and be miles away before Morrison arrives." James turned to look at her, memorizing the gentle curve of her face, the way the candlelight caught the auburn highlights in her hair beneath her coif. If he died today, he wanted her face to be the last beautiful thing he saw in this world. "I could," he agreed quietly. "But then I'd spend whatever years I had left knowing I was a coward who abandoned someone who needed my help. I've carried enough guilt for one lifetime. Sister, I won't add that burden to my soul." Sister Mary Catherine reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and soft against his calloused palm. "Then may God watch over you, James McKenna, and may he forgive me for the violence that's about to occur in his house. A God understands the difference between justice and violence," James replied. "Sometimes good people have to fight to protect the innocent. There's no sin in that." As the sun climbed higher, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. James moved to the window and counted the riders, Morrison and 14 armed men, just as promised. They spread out in a wide circle around the chapel, cutting off all escape routes with military precision. Bartholomew Morrison dismounted near the front steps, his gray eyes scanning the building like a general surveying a fortress he was about to assault. Rex Caldwell and 3 other men took positions near the door while the rest of Morrison's crew formed a perimeter at strategic points around the chapel. "McKenna," Morrison's voice boomed across the morning stillness. "I know you're in there. Come out and face me like a man." James checked his weapons one final time, then stepped into the doorway of the chapel. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers that seemed almost mockingly peaceful given the violence that was about to unfold. "I'm here. Morrison," James called back. "Though I notice you brought quite an audience for what should be a private conversation." Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. "You think this is some kind of honorable duel, Carpenter? This is an execution. You had your chance to leave peacefully and you chose to stay and die, so be it." The rancher gestured to his men, and James saw them begin to move closer, their rifles and pistols gleaming in the morning sun. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for since yesterday's confrontation. He was about to face 15 armed men with nothing but his own skill and whatever help the Almighty might see fit to provide. But as Morrison opened his mouth to give the order to attack, the sound of approaching footsteps made everyone turn. Harold Patterson emerged from behind the general store, carrying a shotgun and wearing a look of grim determination that James had never seen on the mild-mannered shopkeeper's face. "Hold on there, Morrison," Harold called out, his voice steadier than James would have expected. "Seems to me this is a conversation that concerns the whole town, not just you and Mr. McKenna." Morrison's face darkened with fury. "Harold, you stay out of this. Go back to your store and mind your own business before you get hurt." "This is my business," Harold replied, continuing to walk toward the chapel. "Sister Mary Catherine is part of this community. We all have a stake in what happens to her." Before Morrison could respond, another figure appeared from behind the blacksmith shop. Thomas Bradley, the former sheriff turned stable-keeper, emerged carrying his old service revolver and wearing the tin star he hadn't worn in 5 years. Harold's right. Morrison, Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of his former office. What you're proposing to do here today is nothing short of attempted murder, and I can't stand by and let it happen. Morrison's confident smile was beginning to waver as more townspeople appeared. Mrs. Henderson came out of her boarding house with her husband's hunting rifle. Samuel Wright, the blacksmith, carried a heavy hammer in one hand and a pistol in the other. Even old Pete Morrison, no relation to Bartholomew, hobbled forward with a rusty shotgun that looked older than the territorial government itself. "What is this?" Morrison snarled, his gray eyes darting from one face to another as more and more of Cedar Ridge's citizens emerged from their homes and businesses. "Harold, Thomas, all of you, get back to your homes before someone gets hurt. The only one who's going to get hurt is you if you don't call off your men and ride out of here peacefully." Came a new voice from the direction of the main street. James couldn't believe his eyes as Judge Hawthorne stepped into view, flanked by two deputy marshals who had apparently ridden into town during the night. The elderly judge carried himself with the dignity of his office, and his presence seemed to transform the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Judge Hawthorne," Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled but betraying a hint of uncertainty. "What brings you to Cedar Ridge at this early hour?" "Legal business, Morrison," the judge replied coolly. "Specifically questions about certain property deeds that you've been claiming give you ownership of church lands. Deeds that, upon closer examination, appear to be somewhat questionable." Morrison's face went white, then flushed red with anger. "I don't know what you're implying, Judge, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Judge Hawthorne interrupted. "I'm stating facts. The original deed to this land was indeed granted to the Catholic Church by the Hendricks family in 1847. The documents you've been waving around claiming ownership are clever forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless." He pulled a leather portfolio from his coat and extracted several official-looking papers. "I have here the original land grant, properly filed with the territorial office and bearing the authentic seals and signatures. This chapel and the land it sits on belong to the church, not to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's carefully constructed web of intimidation and legal manipulation was unraveling before his eyes, and James could see the desperation beginning to replace the confidence in the rancher's demeanor. "Furthermore," Judge Hawthorne continued, "I have sworn affidavits from 3 witnesses who were present when you threatened Sister Mary Catherine with violence if she refused your unwelcome advances. Such behavior constitutes criminal intimidation and extortion under territorial law." Rex Caldwell stepped closer to his employer, his hand hovering near his gun. "Boss, what do you want us to do?" Morrison's gaze swept across the assembled townspeople, counting odds that were no longer in his favor. What had started as 15 armed men against one lone carpenter had become a standoff between his crew and most of the adult population of Cedar Ridge, backed by legitimate legal authority. "This isn't over," Morrison said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You people don't understand what you're getting yourselves into. I have friends in the territorial capital, connections that reach all the way to Washington. This won't end here." "Maybe not," Thomas Bradley replied, his hand steady on his revolver. "But it ends here today. You and your men are going to mount up and ride out of town, and you're going to leave Sister Mary Catherine and this community in peace." Morrison's cold gray eyes fixed on James with undisguised hatred. "You think you've won something here today, Carpenter? You think these people will always be around to protect you?" "I have a long memory, McKenna. A very long memory." James stepped down from the chapel doorway and walked calmly toward Morrison, stopping just outside arm's reach. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to crackle like lightning before a storm. "I'm counting on it," James said quietly. "Because I want you to remember this moment every time you think about threatening innocent people. I want you to remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the people you try to bully find the courage to fight back." For a moment, James thought Morrison might try to draw his gun despite the odds. The rancher's hand twitched toward his holster, and James tensed, ready to respond with deadly force if necessary. But then Morrison seemed to regain control of himself, and his hand moved away from his weapon. "Mount up," Morrison ordered his men through gritted teeth. "We're leaving." Rex Caldwell looked confused and frustrated. "Boss, we can still take them. We've got the firepower." "I said mount up," Morrison roared, his composure finally cracking. "We're leaving now." As Morrison's men reluctantly returned to their horses, the rancher himself walked to within a few feet of Sister Mary Catherine, who had emerged from the chapel to stand beside James. "This isn't finished between us, sister," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she and James could hear. "You think these people can protect you forever? You think this drifter will always be here to stand between us?" "I'm a patient man, and I always get what I want in the end." Sister Mary Catherine looked Morrison directly in the eyes, her violet gaze unwavering despite the fear James knew she must be feeling. "Mr. Morrison, I will pray for your soul, because it's clearly in grave danger. But I will never, under any circumstances, become your wife. God is my husband, and this community is my family, and nothing you can do will change that." Morrison's face twisted with rage, and something that might have been genuine pain. For just a moment, James saw beneath the rancher's cold exterior to the lonely, damaged man underneath. A man who had convinced himself that anything he wanted could be taken by force or bought with money, including love. Then the mask slipped back into place, and Morrison was once again the ruthless cattle baron who ruled his domain through fear and intimidation. "We'll see about that, sister," he said softly. "We'll see." Morrison mounted his horse and wheeled it around to face the assembled townspeople. "You've made enemies today that you can't afford to have. All of you. Remember that when the consequences come calling, with that ominous warning." Bartholomew Morrison spurred his horse and rode out of Cedar Ridge, followed by his sullen and frustrated crew. The thunder of hoofbeats gradually faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the morning songs of birds in the pine trees. As the tension slowly drained from the scene, James felt his knees go weak with relief. He had been prepared to die fighting Morrison's men, but the unexpected support of the townspeople and the timely arrival of Judge Hawthorne had transformed what should have been a massacre into a peaceful resolution. Thomas Bradley was the first to break the silence, holstering his revolver and removing his badge. "Well, that was more excitement than I've had since I retired from law work." Harold Patterson let out a nervous laugh. "I can't believe we actually stood up to Morrison. My hands are still shaking." Judge Hawthorne approached James and Sister Mary Catherine, his weathered face creased with a satisfied smile. "Mr. McKenna." "Sister Mary Catherine, I'm pleased to see you both safe and unharmed, though I must say, Mr. McKenna, you showed remarkable courage in standing up to Morrison and his men." "I wasn't alone," James replied, looking around at the townspeople who were beginning to disperse back to their homes and businesses. "It seems Cedar Ridge has more brave souls than Morrison gave it credit for." Sister Mary Catherine stepped forward and took Judge Hawthorne's hands in hers. "Judge, how can we ever thank you? If you hadn't arrived when you did—" "Think nothing of it, my dear," the judge replied kindly. "When word reached the territorial capital about Morrison's activities, several of us decided it was time to take a closer look at his business practices. What we found was a pattern of land fraud Intimidation, and worse, that has been going on for years. He tucked the legal documents back into his portfolio. Morrison's reign of terror in this region is coming to an end, I assure you. But I would advise all of you to remain vigilant. Desperate men sometimes do desperate things. As Judge Hawthorne and his deputies prepared to leave town, James found himself alone with Sister Mary Catherine on the steps of the chapel. The morning sun was now shining brightly, burning away the last of the mist and painting the mountains in shades of gold and green. "It's over," Sister Mary Catherine said softly, though James could hear the uncertainty in her voice. For now," James agreed. But Morrison meant what he said about having a long memory. "He'll be back, probably when we least expect it." Sister Mary Catherine turned to face him, her violet eyes shining with tears of gratitude and something deeper. "Then you'll stay? You'll help us prepare for whatever comes next?" James looked out over the peaceful valley, then back at the woman who had somehow helped him find his way back to being the man he was meant to be. The answer came easily, naturally, like water flowing downhill. "Hey, sister, I'm not going anywhere. Cedar Ridge is my home now, and you're part of the reason I want to stay and fight for it." For the first time since he had known her, Sister Mary Catherine smiled without reservation, her whole face lighting up with joy and hope. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together. Along with the community that had found the courage to stand up for what was right. The battle was won, but James knew the war was far from over. Morrison would regroup, plan, and return when he thought they were vulnerable. But for now, in this moment, there was peace in Cedar Ridge, and that was enough. Part 7. Climax and Victory. 3 days had passed since Morrison's humiliating retreat from Cedar Ridge, and an uneasy peace had settled over the mountain town. James McKenna spent his time helping Thomas Bradley repair the stable roof and discussing plans with Sister Mary Catherine for the chapel expansion. But beneath the surface calm, everyone knew that Bartholomew Morrison was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. The warning came at sunset on Thursday evening, delivered by a frightened Mexican boy who worked at Morrison's ranch. The child, no more than 12 years old, rode his pony hard into town and went straight to Thomas Bradley's stable. "Senor Bradley," the boy gasped, his dark eyes wide with fear. "Senor Morrison, he is coming. Tonight. With many men. More than before." Thomas immediately sent the boy to James, who was sharing supper with Sister Mary Catherine in the small rectory behind the chapel. The child's message was brief but chilling. Morrison had spent the past 3 days recruiting additional gunmen from neighboring territories. He now had over 20 armed men at his disposal, and they were planning a night attack on Cedar Ridge. "He means to burn us out," James said grimly, his hand moving instinctively to his gun belt. "Come under cover of darkness, set fire to the buildings, and force us into the open where his men can pick us off." Sister Mary Catherine's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "What can we do? We don't have enough armed men to face 20 gunfighters." James was quiet for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Then his eyes lit up with a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. "Maybe we don't need to face them head on. Morrison's counting on finding us asleep and unprepared. What if we give him exactly what he expects to see? But it's not what it appears to be." Within an hour, James had gathered the town's leaders in the chapel: Thomas Bradley, Harold Patterson, Samuel Wright the blacksmith, and Judge Hawthorne, who had decided to remain in Cedar Ridge for a few extra days. James outlined his plan quickly and efficiently, like a general preparing for battle. Morrison will expect to find us in our beds, defenseless and scattered throughout the town. James explained. "Instead, we're going to be waiting for him, Every family needs to evacuate their homes immediately and take shelter in the mine shaft outside town. Make it look like you've gone to bed normally, leave lamps burning, but get out through the back doors and windows. Harold Patterson looked skeptical. That still leaves us outnumbered more than 2-1. James, even if we surprise them, we're not gunfighters. We don't need to be, James replied. We just need to convince Morrison that the cost of taking Cedar Ridge is higher than he's willing to pay. Most of his new recruits are hired guns who work for money, not loyalty. If we can make them think they're walking into a death trap, they'll abandon Morrison faster than rats leaving a sinking ship. Thomas Bradley nodded slowly. It could work, but we'll need someone to stay in town as bait, make Morrison think we're all asleep and vulnerable. That someone is me, James said firmly. I'll be in the chapel, visible through the windows. When Morrison's men move to surround the building, you'll have them in a crossfire from the other buildings. Sister Mary Catherine grabbed James's arm. No, I won't let you make yourself a target. If this plan fails, we're all going to be targets anyway. James interrupted gently. At least this way, we have a fighting chance. As the townspeople hurried to evacuate their families and take up positions, James made his final preparations in the chapel. He placed several lamps around the interior to create the illusion of normal evening activity, then positioned himself where he could be seen through the front windows while still having cover behind the heavy wooden altar. Sister Mary Catherine refused to leave with the other women and children, insisting on remaining in the chapel to pray for the town's deliverance. James didn't have the heart to argue with her, and truthfully, her presence strengthened his resolve to see this fight through to the end. The attack came just after midnight, exactly as James had predicted. The thunder of hoofbeats echoed through the valley as Morrison's enlarged force rode into Cedar Ridge under cover of darkness. James watched through the chapel window as shadowy figures dismounted and began moving through the town with military precision. Bartholomew Morrison himself rode straight up to the chapel, his gray eyes fixed on the lighted windows with predatory satisfaction. Behind him came Rex Caldwell and at least 20 other men, all heavily armed and moving with the confidence of professionals who expected an easy victory. "McKenna," Morrison's voice boomed through the night air. "I know you're in there. Come out and face justice for the trouble you've caused." James stepped into the chapel doorway, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Justice? That's an interesting word coming from a man who hires killers to do his dirty work. Morrison's laugh was cold and triumphant. "You had your chance to leave peacefully, Carpenter. Now you'll pay the price for your interference. Boys, burn everything. Leave nothing standing." But as Morrison's men began to spread out to torch the buildings, the night suddenly erupted in gunfire. Thomas Bradley's voice rang out from the darkness behind the general store. "Drop your weapons! You're surrounded!" Muzzle flashes lit up the night as the hidden townspeople opened fire from their concealed positions. Morrison's hired guns, caught completely off guard, scrambled for cover while bullets whistled around them. The carefully planned night raid had turned into a chaotic firefight, with Morrison's forces trapped in the crossfire they had never expected. "It's a trap!" Rex Caldwell shouted, diving behind a water trough as Harold Patterson's shotgun roared from the roof of his store. "Boss, they were ready for us!" 2 of Morrison's men went down in the first volley, wounded but not killed. The rest returned fire wildly, shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows, their panic evident in their erratic shooting. These were men accustomed to intimidating unarmed settlers, not fighting a determined enemy that shot back. Morrison himself seemed stunned by the turn of events. He had been so confident in his overwhelming numbers and surprise attack that the possibility of organized resistance had never occurred to him. Now he found himself in the middle of a battlefield, with his hired guns falling back in disarray. "I stand and fight, you cowards," Morrison roared at his retreating men. "It's just a handful of shopkeepers and farmers." But his words fell on deaf ears. 3 more of his gunmen had been wounded, and the rest were beginning to realize that their employer had led them into a well-planned ambush. Money was one thing, but no amount of pay was worth dying for a madman's obsession with a woman who didn't want him. James took advantage of the chaos to move closer to Morrison, using the chapel steps as cover. The rancher was still mounted, trying desperately to rally his scattered forces, when James called out to him, "Morrison, this is between you and me. Leave your men out of it." The rancher spun his horse around, his gray eyes blazing with fury and frustration. "You think you're clever, don't you, Carpenter? Setting up this little ambush, turning my own men against me. But it won't save you in the end." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but James was ready for him. The Colt 44 seemed to leap into James's hand with the speed born of countless hours of practice in logging camps where a slow draw meant a quick death. His shot rang out just as Morrison cleared leather, the bullet striking the rancher's gun hand and sending his weapon spinning into the darkness. Morrison cried out in pain and rage, clutching his wounded hand against his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, black in the moonlight, and his face contorted with a mixture of agony and disbelief. "Impossible," he gasped. "You're just a carpenter, a nobody drifter." "I'm a man defending his home and the people he cares about," James replied, keeping his gun trained on the wounded rancher. "That makes all the difference." Around them, the gunfight was winding down as Morrison's demoralized forces began to retreat. Thomas Bradley and the other townspeople emerged from their hiding places, herding the wounded gunmen into a group under guard. Several of Morrison's hired guns had already fled into the night, abandoning their employer to his fate. Rex Caldwell, bleeding from a graze on his forehead, raised his hands in surrender as Samuel Wright approached with his blacksmith's hammer raised threateningly. "Don't shoot," Caldwell said wearily. "I'm done. This whole thing's gone to hell." Judge Hawthorne appeared from his hiding place behind the courthouse, carrying a pair of iron shackles that looked like they had seen considerable use. "Bartholomew Morrison," he said formally, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, attempted arson, criminal intimidation, and a dozen other charges that will keep you in territorial prison for the rest of your natural life." Morrison stared at the judge in disbelief, still clutching his wounded hand. "You can't do this to me. I have friends, connections, influence." "You had those things," Judge Hawthorne corrected him. "But when word reaches the territorial capital about tonight's events, you'll find that your friends have suddenly developed very poor memories. Nobody wants to be associated with a man who hires an army of gunfighters to attack a peaceful community." As Thomas Bradley helped the judge secure Morrison in shackles, Sister Mary Catherine emerged from the chapel and walked slowly toward James. Her violet eyes shone with tears of relief and gratitude, and her face glowed with a radiance that seemed to light up the entire night. "It's over," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "It's really over." James holstered his gun and took her hands in his, feeling the warmth and softness that had become so precious to him. For now, there will always be other Morrisons, other challenges. But tonight, justice won. Sister Mary Catherine looked up at him with an expression that made James's heart race. "James McKenna, you are the most remarkable man I have ever known. You came to our town as a stranger, and you've become our protector, our champion, our friend," James suggested gently. Sister Mary Catherine smiled, her whole face lighting up with joy. "Yes, our friend, and mine especially. as the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains. The people of Cedar Ridge gathered in the town square to survey the aftermath of the battle. A few buildings bore bullet holes, and there were scorch marks where some of Morrison's men had tried to light torches before the ambush began. But the damage was minimal. More importantly, not a single member of the community had been seriously injured. Morrison's wounded gunmen were loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial prison, along with their shackled employer. The rancher's empire of intimidation and corruption had crumbled in a single night, brought down by the courage of ordinary people who had finally found the strength to stand together against tyranny. Judge Hawthorne shook James's hand warmly before departing with his prisoners. "Mr. McKenna, what you've done here tonight will be remembered for a long time. You've shown that justice can prevail even in the most remote corners of our territory." As the judge's wagon disappeared into the morning mist, James found himself alone with Sister Mary Catherine on the chapel steps. The sun was rising over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the peaceful valley spread out before them like a promise of better days to come. "What happens now?" Sister Mary Catherine asked softly. James looked out over the town that had become his home, thinking of the chapel expansion they had planned, the school that needed building, the community that would continue to grow and prosper now that Morrison's shadow had been lifted from it. "Now we build," he said simply, "that we build a future worth fighting for." Sister Mary Catherine smiled and took his arm, her touch warm and comforting. "Together?" James nodded, feeling more at peace than he had since Elizabeth's death. Together. As they walked back toward the chapel, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Cedar Ridge awakened to its first truly free day in years. The battle was won. Justice had prevailed, and love in all its forms had triumphed over hatred and greed. But in the back of James's mind, a small voice whispered that this victory, complete as it seemed, might not be the end of their story. Men like Morrison had a way of reaching out from prison cells, and the wilderness was full of dangers that had nothing to do with corrupt ranchers and hired guns. Still, for now, there was peace in the valley, and that was enough. Part 8. Epilogue and Aftermath. 6 months had passed since the night Bartholomew Morrison's empire of fear crumbled in the streets of Cedar Ridge. The mountain town had transformed beyond recognition, blossoming like wildflowers after a spring rain. Where once there had been an atmosphere of oppression and fear, now there was hope, prosperity, and the unmistakable energy of a community building something lasting and good. James McKenna stood on the front steps of the newly completed schoolhouse, wiping sawdust from his hands as he surveyed his handiwork. The building was solid and beautiful, constructed from the finest pine timber the Colorado mountains could provide. Large windows faced east to catch the morning light, and a small bell tower crowned the structure like a benediction. Inside, neat rows of desks waited for the children who would soon fill them with laughter and learning. "It's beautiful, James," Sister Mary Catherine said, joining him on the steps. "The children are going to love it." James smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from creating something with his own hands that would serve the community for generations to come. It should last 100 years or more, if it's properly maintained. That pine is some of the best I've ever worked with. The past 6 months had been a time of remarkable growth for Cedar Ridge. Word had spread throughout the territory about the town that had stood up to Bartholomew Morrison and won. Families seeking a fresh start had begun arriving weekly, drawn by reports of good land, honest governance, and a community that welcomed newcomers with open arms. The population had more than doubled, and with it had come new businesses, a proper blacksmith shop run by young William Harrison, recently arrived from Kansas, a bakery operated by the widow Martha Collins and her 3 daughters. even a small newspaper edited by Frederick Whitman, a former journalist from Denver who had grown tired of city life. James himself had become something of a local legend, though he was uncomfortable with the attention. Stories of the lonely lumberjack who had stood against Morrison's army grew more elaborate with each telling, until some versions had him single-handedly defeating a dozen gunmen in mortal combat. The truth was more modest, but perhaps more meaningful. He had found a home worth defending and people worth protecting. The town council had offered him the position of sheriff, but James had declined, preferring to continue his work as a carpenter and builder. There was something deeply satisfying about creating things rather than simply enforcing the law. And Cedar Ridge had enough peace now that Thomas Bradley could handle any minor disputes that arose. Instead, James had accepted the council's offer to deed him a plot of land just outside town, where he had built a modest cabin with a view of both the chapel and the mountains beyond. It was a good life, simple and honest, filled with meaningful work and surrounded by people he had come to love as family. The chapel itself had been expanded according to Sister Mary Catherine's original plans. A new wing housed both a proper schoolroom and a small clinic where she could tend to the sick and injured. The congregation had grown from 20 souls to nearly 80, requiring additional pews and a larger altar to accommodate the increasing numbers. Sister Mary Catherine had blossomed along with the town. The fear and worry that had shadowed her violet eyes for so long had been replaced by joy and purpose. She had become not just the spiritual heart of Cedar Ridge, but its moral compass, settling disputes with wisdom beyond her years and providing comfort to anyone in need. James often found himself watching her during Sunday services, marveling at the transformation. She moved with confidence now, secure in the knowledge that she was protected and valued by her community. Her laughter, once so rare, had become as much a part of Cedar Ridge's character as the sound of the chapel bell or the whisper of wind through the pines. Their own relationship had deepened into something that transcended simple friendship, though it remained within the bounds of propriety dictated by her religious vows. They spent hours together planning community projects, discussing theology and philosophy, or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. James had found in her not just a woman to admire, but a kindred spirit who understood both his strengths and his struggles. The subject of Elizabeth and their lost child had come up gradually, naturally, as trust and intimacy grew between them. Sister Mary Catherine had listened with tears in her eyes as James finally spoke about his grief and guilt, offering neither judgment nor empty platitudes, but simple human compassion. In return, she had shared her own story of loss, a family destroyed by disease back east, a calling to serve God born from her own experience of suffering. "We both know what it means to lose everything," she had said one evening as they walked together through the pine groves surrounding the town. "Perhaps that's why God brought us together, so we could help each other find a way to build something new from the ashes of what we've lost." Now, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, James felt a peace he had never expected to experience again. The pain of losing Elizabeth and their son would always be with him, but it no longer defined his entire existence. He had found purpose, community, and love in forms he had never anticipated, as he and Sister Mary Catherine walked toward the chapel for evening prayers. Harold Patterson approached them with an expression of concern. The storekeeper was carrying a letter, its envelope bearing the official seal of the territorial prison. "James, Sister Mary Catherine," Harold said, his voice tight with worry. "This just came on the afternoon stage. It's from the warden at the territorial prison." James felt a chill run down his spine as he accepted the letter. He had been expecting something like this for months, knowing that Morrison's story couldn't end with a simple imprisonment. Men like the former cattle baron had resources and connections that extended far beyond prison walls. With Sister Mary Catherine reading over his shoulder, James opened the letter and scanned its contents. The words seemed to leap off the page. Escaped, guards killed, armed and dangerous, believed to be gathering former associates for revenge. "My dear God," Sister Mary Catherine whispered, "he's coming back." James folded the letter carefully, his mind already shifting into the focused, purposeful state that had served him well in dangerous situations. When did he escape? Harold consulted the envelope's postmark. This letter is dated 5 days ago, allowing for travel time. Morrison could already be in the territory. "How many men does the warden think he might have with him?" Sister Mary Catherine asked. James reread the relevant section. "Unknown, but they suspect he's contacted Rex Caldwell and other former associates. The warden estimates he could have as many as a dozen armed men." A small crowd had begun to gather as word spread through the town. Thomas Bradley hurried over from the stable, his hand already resting on his gun butt. Samuel Wright emerged from his blacksmith shop carrying a rifle, and other townspeople began appearing from their homes and businesses. "What do we do?" Harold asked. "Should we send for the territorial marshals?" James shook his head. "By the time help arrives, Morrison will have struck and disappeared back into the mountains. We're on our own, just like before." But even as he spoke the words, James realized they weren't quite accurate. Cedar Ridge was no longer the frightened, isolated community it had been 6 months ago. The population had more than doubled, and many of the newcomers were experienced frontiersmen who knew how to handle weapons and defend themselves. "We need to call a town meeting." James decided everyone needs to know what we're facing, and we need to make plans for defense. Within an hour, nearly the entire adult population of Cedar Ridge had gathered in the chapel. James stood before the altar, looking out at faces that reflected determination rather than fear. These people had stood up to Morrison once before, and they were prepared to do so again. "Friends," James began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed chapel. "We all knew this day might come. Bartholomew Morrison has escaped from prison, and he's almost certainly planning to return here for revenge." A murmur ran through the crowd, but James was pleased to note that it sounded more angry than afraid. These people had tasted freedom from Morrison's tyranny, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. Thomas Bradley stood up from the front pew. "How do you want to handle this, James? Same plan as before?" James shook his head. "Morrison won't make the same mistakes twice. He knows we'll be ready for him now, so he'll try a different approach. My guess is he'll attempt to take hostages, probably children or families he can use as leverage against us." Martha Collins, the baker, raised her hand. "What do you suggest we do?" First, no one travels alone, especially women and children. Everyone should go armed, and we need to set up a watch rotation to keep eyes on the approaches to town. Second, we should prepare a secure location where non-combatants can take shelter if shooting starts. Sister Mary Catherine stepped forward. "The chapel has thick walls and good sight lines. We could use it as a stronghold if necessary." "Good thinking," James agreed. "We'll also need to—" His words were cut off by the sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching the town. Everyone in the chapel tensed, hands moving toward weapons. But the rider who burst through the doors was young Billy Henderson, Martha Collins' eldest son. "Mr. McKenna," the boy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Men on horseback coming from the south, 8 or 10 of them, moving fast." James felt his blood turn to ice. "How far out?" "Maybe 20 minutes, Billy panted. They were riding hard, like they meant business. The chapel erupted in controlled chaos as people began moving toward the exits, but James's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Wait. Everyone stay calm and listen carefully. This could be exactly what Morrison wants, to catch us scattered and panicking. He quickly organized the townspeople into groups, armed men to take defensive positions, women and children to secure locations, scouts to gather intelligence about Morrison's numbers and intentions. It was a testament to the community's growth and unity that his orders were followed without question or argument. As the chapel emptied, Sister Mary Catherine remained beside James. "I should go with the other women," she said, though her tone suggested she had no intention of hiding while others fought. "No," James replied firmly. "Your place is here, in the chapel. This is your home, your calling. If Morrison wants to destroy what we've built here, he'll have to go through both of us." Sister Mary Catherine smiled, her violet eyes shining with fierce determination. "Then we'll face him together, just as we've faced everything else." Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew louder, and James could hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather that meant armed men prepared for violence. Through the chapel windows, he caught sight of familiar figures. Morrison himself, looking gaunt and dangerous after his months in prison. Rex Caldwell with his arm in a sling from an old wound, and at least 8 other hard-faced men who had the look of hired killers. But Morrison had made a crucial miscalculation. He had expected to find the same frightened, isolated community he had terrorized before. Instead, he was facing a town that had grown strong and united, led by people who had already proven they wouldn't be intimidated. As the sound of gunfire began to echo through the valley, James McKenna checked his weapons one final time and prepared to defend his home once again. The story of Cedar Ridge was far from over, and its next chapter was about to be written in courage, determination, and the unbreakable bonds of community. Sister Mary Catherine knelt beside him before the altar, her lips moving in silent prayer. Outside, the battle for the soul of Cedar Ridge was about to begin anew, but this time, they were ready. The peaceful valley would soon echo with gunfire once more. But James felt no fear. He had found his purpose, his home, and his family. Whatever happened next, he would face it as he had learned to face all challenges, with courage, determination, and faith in the power of good people standing together against the darkness. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to promise both endings and new beginnings. In the gathering twilight, Cedar Ridge prepared to defend its hard-won freedom one more time.